Hey there, welcome to LSAT Demon Daily. I am Erik Johansson, and one of my favorite things to do in my experience as an LSAT teacher and here on the podcast is to get emails from y'all, the listeners, updating us about the fantastic scores that you got when you go out and crush the LSAT for realsies. Well, here is one such person who just demolished the LSAT as much as you possibly can with a fresh 180 in hand. Micah, thanks so much for coming on the show.
Thank you. And it's really funny that our conversation was initially me asking you what score I should be willing to retake at, because I was so convinced I did poorly. I was like, if I make a 171, should I retake it? And then it turned out better than I suspected.
That's right. You emailed the show asking, "Hey, here's how I'm doing. I've practice tested up to like a 178 or so, I think it was." And then if I think it was at like 173, if I get worse than 173, should I retake? Well, no need to be worried about that anymore. So this was your first attempt, right?
This is my first attempt.
Okay. How did you feel going into test day? Were you just locked in and ready to go?
Terrible. Awful. Worst test conditions ever.
Okay.
I literally slept 4 hours. I was all stressed out. I was on a call late. And I wake up, I feel awful, but I can't go back to sleep. And I try to log into the LSAT, and it takes me like an hour and 15 minutes. Okay. Like I was just convinced I needed to take it in person next time because it was so stressful getting in. But once I got into the test, it felt really easy. I still wasn't confident, but obviously I did everything well, but I'd been drilling on maximum difficulty with all my questions. And so I was like, when I was at the beginning of those sections, I was like, this is for babies. Like, this is not very hard at all. And so that made me feel a little bit better.
Yeah. Was it instant? The moment you started, you locked in, you were like, all that stuff, the difficulty getting started, completely forgot. Now I'm like from question one, I'm good at this. This is fun.
Right. I blew past the questions. I had so much time left that I literally was able to go through like half the questions again that I had marked. And of course, I was sure that I would get something wrong because I have self-doubt, but I couldn't imagine how any of the ones I looked over, I got wrong. And
you didn't. Or if you did, maybe one of them and you still got the 180, but amazing to have that confidence. A great feeling. I mean, you were ready to take the test again if you had to, I'm sure.
Yeah, I had actually scheduled it. I canceled it right on the day of the deadline to get a refund, which was nice. But I was convinced I was going to have to do it. And that's why, whenever I got the score back, the story is actually pretty funny. I saw an email on my phone and it said, "Your LSAT score is here." So of course I click it all nervously and it says 180. And I'm like, yeah, that's totally not right. I'm not going to tell anyone about this because I'm not going to embarrass myself. I get on my computer, I look it up, it says 180. Still don't believe it. I call them and wait on hold because LSAT takes forever. And eventually they tell me, "Sir, your score is 180. Congratulations."
Was it that gruff of a tone of voice? They were like, "Yes, it's actually, can you please just accept it and move on?"
Yeah, I was like frantically asking them like, "What's wrong here?" And then I told my parents, and my parents are Iranian, so of course the Middle Eastern parents, they're like, "Oh, good."
Didn't really understand what that meant.
Totally over their head. Oh, nice, cool.
Have you been able to share it with anybody who really understood it and appreciated it, or is it just like you exist as the one LSAT person in your life, and you've been like trying to get people to recognize, this is actually a big deal?
Well, actually, so I posted it and some of my friends posted on social media. On Twitter, got like 9,000 likes.
Nice.
It went pretty well. I mean, I think people were randomly talking about it at my school. So I got texts from people that are like, "Micah, there's these random people talking about your score." So that was really cool. All my friends that were studying for the LSAT with me hate my guts now because they're like, now they can't argue with me whenever I tell them about my strategies. So
was this a point of contention? People who were doing it maybe like a non-LSAT demon way, and you were, "No, I think what we're doing here, we're onto something."
I was so confident. I was like, "Listen, guys, don't read that book. That book is stupid. Stop. Get your highlighter and put it back in your backpack. This is ridiculous." And of course, they'd argue with me.
Yeah.
And now what can they can't argue with me. I didn't get one wrong. So what are you going to argue with?
All right. So let's drill in on what it was that worked for you, because, all right, apparently now you're just a mini celebrity there on campus, and people are going to be flocking to the 180 to ask, how did you do it? What was the secret sauce? So yeah, if someone comes up to you and says, hey, I'm struggling on the LSAT, what am I doing wrong? What is the first thing you would tell them?
So yeah, I've gotten like so many texts and calls. So I've kind of refined my tips. I think the LSAT is basically just testing three things. First, it's being able to tell the difference between necessary and sufficient, if and only if. Like these are, if you can understand that, bam, like you just made a 150 on the LSAT. Number two is understanding formal arguments. I understand this because I've studied philosophy. Premise, conclusion. If your conclusion states something that's not in your premises, it's wrong. And like so many questions are basically just a bad argument that's missing a premise. And it asks you basically what's wrong with this, or what do you need to add to fix it? It's the same thing. And the last one is reading comprehension. I think a lot of social science majors, poli-sci people think they're going to be good at the LSAT because they read a lot. Your reading style in poli-sci is skimming. You need to comprehend every single line. And the way you do that is by interacting with what it says. The best tip that y'all ever gave me was to criticize the living hell out of everything you're reading. I would be arguing in my mind with each sentence that I was reading to force me to focus. And that helped me the most because RC was my hardest section.
Yeah, I like to think about having a conversation with the author as you read, being real demanding about, okay, you're saying this, but can you back that up? Like, I'm not immediately buying it. Okay, so RC was the hardest. It sounds like, and we talked ahead of time, so I know that you have some background in philosophy, so experience with picking apart arguments, looking at argument structure, so maybe logical reasoning a little more natural to you. What was it that got you rolling in reading comprehension, if that was your weak part to start?
I think the hardest part was making your way through a paragraph and just not knowing what it said. And like, I'm a big skimmer. Like I like to read papers and like I like to read economics papers. I don't read the whole thing. I'm just trying to find like where the interesting conclusion is, where the R squared is. And it was by forcing myself to interact with it or having a task, like summarize what they said, that I started to actually start comprehending each thing they were saying and how it connected to some sort of intention, some sort of argument, some sort of narrative. And so that helped me a lot.
So seeing the argument within the longer RC passage.
Right.
Yeah.
Like, I think that the best thing you can do is just force yourself to interact with it. And like also summarize it to people. Like I would study with friends with RC sections and I'd read a paragraph and I would force myself to try to summarize and explain what it said. And then we'd be able to see, okay, did I do a good job or not? And so now I'm like, oh crap, like I don't want to embarrass myself. Now I actually like really need to focus on this.
Yeah. Were you studying with people, with study buddies the whole time through?
Not the entire time. Oh my God, that would have been insufferable. But like for some select reading that's how I started getting rolling on reading comprehension. Logical reasoning, I mostly did alone.
Gotcha. Now, you mentioned drilling and just how when you got into the official test, it was like, you know, the easy ones were super easy because you'd just been drilling level 5 questions. What was your balance of drilling with timed practice?
So I did like a ridiculously disproportionate amount of drilling. I took 2 practice tests. My first one was my diagnostic, a 166. My second one was a 178. I did 6 practice sections that were timed. And those are mostly just to measure my time ability. But I noticed by doing just a ridiculous amount of drills, you could get through them so much quicker. When I first started, sometimes I'd spend 30 minutes on a single question because, like y'all told me, figure it out. You know, like LSAT questions are not hard. So if it looks like it's hard, you haven't figured it out yet.
So to clarify, that's 30 minutes before you hit submit, right?
Yes.
Okay, good.
Yeah, it's like, wow, that's a ridiculous amount of time. I mean, like, I'm sure you've gone through it where you've looked at a question, you've been like, yeah, there's 2 answers here that are totally both reasonable. And I just would not submit. Like I would close my eyes, do a couple spins around and look at it until I figured it out. And of course, sometimes I get it wrong. And then I would obsess for the next like 30 minutes on figuring out exactly why it was wrong.
Yeah. In those moments when there were multiple answer choices that looked good to you, was there a thought process that you went through, or was there something like, because I have some ideas for what I would do in that situation, but was there some method you developed for like, oh, if this is happening to me, this is the step that I should take to try to unstick myself?
Usually it's rereading, because a lot of times, at least for me, I would have just misread a sentence. Or, I think the hardest ones were always those really long ones where it's like, which one of these has a parallel argument to the one that's presented in the passage? And it's like, oh crap, like multiple of these look like there's alignment. But once you say, okay, is this a necessary claim or a sufficient claim? Is this a necessary claim or a sufficient claim? You could kind of do those parallels. And I think that the thing that helped a lot was developing the ability to predict. I started to break down the questions like those into, okay, first is a necessary statement, second is a sufficient statement. And then you can just like look for the key words and you've immediately narrowed it down to maybe two options, or maybe you've immediately found your one correct answer.
With prediction, I love when you can predict the answer after you've read part of the argument, where you're like halfway through an argument and you can see ahead of time the flaw that they're about to make. And you're like, oh, I know what question type this is. I'm not even done reading, but I know what question type this is. And I know what the answer is going to be.
Right. And that's what drilling taught me. And that's why I was able to go so quickly, because I was just like, oh, wrong. This is correct.
Yeah. But it's still, so I agree with you. Drilling is huge for that, just for building that discipline to stick with it until you get it right and know that you've got it right. It is still pretty wild to me that you did 2 full practice tests and you said like 6 timed sections total. Over what period of time are we talking about? Like how long of a study period?
It's 3 months.
3 months. Okay. So that's a little more reasonable. I mean, pretty short, and acknowledge that 166 is about the highest, probably the highest diagnostic score I've ever heard of. So you were starting from a good place, but yeah, 3 months, you were far more heavily weighted on the drilling. So I think that's a good takeaway for listeners, that still works. You're still improving. You're still learning lessons.
Right.
Even if you're not doing a practice
right. And
test
for me, it was
weekend.
a necessity, because I was working full time and I have like all these extracurricular things and events. And I was like, okay, like 2.5 hours or like 3 hours for a full practice test. And then I have to do all my review. Like there's just no way that I'm going to like be able to get that kind of block of time together, to do all 4 sections and then review it. And so I was like, fine, I had to drill. And that's what made me nervous about test day, because I was like, oh crap, like maybe I'm just going to like run out of time or something. But I think it really does work, especially when you get those scores up. It's kind of addicting. Like I got to like a 99 or something on logical reasoning. And I was like, wow, look at this amazing score. You could track your progress.
166 to 178 is a pretty big jump from a diagnostic to a second practice test. What are the big things that you can think of besides maybe just more exposure to the test? What was it that allowed for that jump? Like what explains improvement from mid 160s to high 170s?
So I think when I started, I didn't understand the words for necessary and sufficient and all the different ways in which that could like materialize.
So you knew the concepts, but not how they were implemented or specifically worded all the time.
Right. Gotcha. And I didn't understand all the flaws that can materialize. Like I knew it wasn't the same thing, but there's a lot of arguments where it's like, okay, well, this thing happened, then this thing happened. Therefore, the thing that happened backwards will cause this thing. And like I didn't understand all the different ways in which those flaws can happen. And so listening to explanations made me understand that. And the second thing was time. Like when I first took it, I think about 60 or 70% of the ones I got wrong were just ones I ran out of time on.
What do you mean by ran out of time on? Because like you didn't finish the section, you didn't get to them?
Yeah. Like when I took my first practice test, like there was a bunch of questions at the end where I was like, there's no way we're going to get to that. And I listened to y'all's advice Just make sure the ones that you answered were correct.
Cool. So you already knew from the beginning, don't worry about finishing the section. Just be perfect on the ones you actually attempt.
Yes. And it was extremely stressful. Y'all said, don't look at the clock. Totally looked at the clock.
Yeah.
It was killing me the entire time, even though it was a practice test.
Did you look at the clock on test day?
No, because I was like, okay, I did look at the clock, but it actually made me feel better, not worse. Because, okay, so I was like already done with like half of the questions, and I had like 25 minutes left. And so I felt great. I was like, actually, I'm on like extra time, because I have all this time left over. So it was more of like a mental crutch than something that was like punishing for me.
Mm. So what's next for you? I mean, presumably you're not going to continue studying unless you just love the LSAT that much, but you're on to, hey, you laugh, but like I said, I studied three years ago and I'm still doing it. So on to applications now, law school apps.
Yes. Thankfully, I don't have to look at an LSAT question again. I'm actually scared of taking another practice test for fear that my abilities have gone down. So I'm going to just hold it at 180, never take it again. And, my average, I don't have to ever worry about my record. I am applying to law schools. My original plan, which I told you in the email, was to go to Georgetown or UT. And I was really not even thinking about applying anywhere else. I am applying more broadly now and working really hard on my personal statement so I can have a lot of options.
Taking some home run swings at some really, really top schools.
Yeah, I wasn't even considering them before. I was like, there's no way. Like, no one in my family has gone to like professional school like that. My mom didn't even go to college. She just went to like hairdressing school. So right now I go to the University of Houston, which is just kind of our local state school. So I never even like considered the possibility of.
Yeah. How did you become interested in law? If it's not in your family, if it doesn't come from people that you know, how did you become interested?
So I'm actually really well positioned to answer this question because it's the story of my personal statement.
Amazing.
Somewhere around like 12 years old, I became like super interested in like politics. I really liked like law, regulatory schemes, taxation, institutional design, because
normal 12-year-old stuff. Sure.
It was really, I watched C-SPAN like on planes, and I thought it was like these like really elaborate systems, which were so like miserably inefficient, and like we could design them and they could just be better for everyone, right? Like, things like abortion are polarizing and like really related to morals, but who hates efficiency? Nobody hates efficiency. And so I knew that if I could help make things more efficient, I would be absolutely making the world a better place, and I didn't have to worry about being the bad guy. And so as time went on, I kind of learned that like, wow, a lot of people that have the roles that are related to this are lawyers. Maybe that's the best career path for me.
Thing that we haven't talked about yet that you thought was crucial to your LSAT journey, as short and meteoric is the wrong word because that's going the wrong direction.
Yeah, hopefully
you were riding a rocket to the top. Like anything else that helped ignite that spark?
I would say that I did listen to the podcast a lot. And I think the podcast was genuinely helpful. I mean, there was a time in which I wouldn't miss an episode. I just listened to it every day. And so I think that was helpful. I think the calculator was really cool too, because it kind of helped me figure out like what was okay. I think like for me, I'm the kind of person who's like, am I doing it right? Am I doing this correctly? Like very, very, I want like assurance, and y'all's content gave me like assurance. Okay, this is what I need to do. And if I do it, I'll succeed. And I think once you kind of find the path, I mean, all you need is the motivation to use it. And so I really appreciate it. Especially, I encourage everyone I know to use LSAT Demon because there's clarity and it works. It worked for me. It's worked for a lot of people. It's worked for a lot of my friends that I know. And I really appreciate that you guys have a simple formula that has no gimmicks, because the gimmicks are exhausting.
Well, I appreciate that. I totally agree. All right, before I let you go, and thank you for sharing your time and all this. It's just been a blast catching up and hearing about your journey. Always fun to nerd out about the LSAT with someone who clearly has enjoyed it too. So before I let you go, there's someone listening right now who is not sure where to start, and they know that the LSAT is a hill they have to climb, but they don't even know how to begin. What should they do once this podcast finishes?
Go start a drill. If you look at it and it looks like another language, that's fine. Try to figure it out. When you get it wrong, look at the explanations. And if the explanations are not ones you like, go look at the question until you find an explanation. Eventually, it will make sense to you. There's so many people that start out in your position where nothing made sense, and eventually everything made sense. Because the LSAT isn't hard. There's only one right answer, and you have everything you need to succeed at it. I genuinely think that anybody can make over a 170 on the LSAT.
Micah, thank you so much. This has been a real treat. I hope you will stay in touch and let us know when you get into some amazing, highly ranked law school that's going to allow you to fix all the problems and just make our country as efficient as possible.
Yeah, efficient. Okay, watch out, tax systems. We're going to make you as efficient as I possibly can.
I'm glad we've got you on the case. Thanks, Micah. Email daily@lsatdemon.com if you'd like to ask us a question or share some LSAT or law school admissions news. Thanks for listening.